Benazir Bhutto, Chapter 9, page number 69. On May 29, 1988, Zia unexpectedly dissolved parliament, fired his Prime Minister Mohammad Khan Junaiza, and called for elections within 90 days. Bhutto and the PPP doubted that the elections would be conducted honestly, but they prepared for them with optimism. It occurred to Bhutto that the election date might have been chosen cynically. She had recently announced that she was expecting a baby, and the dates Zia had set for the election seemed likely to coincide with her delivery. The PPP went to the Supreme Court to challenge Zia's 1985 voter registration clause, which permitted the administration to disallow a party from participating in elections on flimsy grounds, and Bhutto went on an energetic PR tour of the country, despite her pregnancy and the summer heat. The success of the PPP made Zia begin to panic, and in July he announced that candidates could only run as individuals, not party members. The PPP and other parties that made up the MRD struggled to keep up with the barrage of conflicting presidential decrees. But suddenly on August 17, 1988, all the rules of Pakistani political game were rewritten. Zia had been at a military base near Bahawalpur that morning to watch a demonstration of the new Abrams tank from the United States. The demonstration turned out to be a disaster, with the tank missile missing its target every time it fired. That afternoon, he boarded Pak-1 Lockheed C-130 aircraft, getting into the VIP capsule with several other very important people. General Akhtar Abdul Rahman, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and as head of the ISI, the architect of Afghan war against the Soviet and organizer of the Mujahideen network, General Mohammad Afzal, Chief of the General Staff, the American Ambassador, and Arnold L. Rafael, General Herbert M. Basham, the head of the US military and mission to Pakistan, and 8 other Pakistani generals. The Vice Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Aslam Beg, was the only top member of the chain of command not on board. He was flying back to the Islamabad in his own jet. The plane took off almost immediately. Ground control at Bahawalpur was unable to reach the pilots. 18 miles away, the plane was seen to be out of control, swerving and diving. It finally plunged nose first into the ground and exploded. All 30 people on board died in the flames. Aslam Beg, flying nearby in his own jet, witnessed the accident and returned post haste to Islamabad, where he quickly took control of government buildings and television stations. Investigation indicated sabotage, very possibly with a gas bomb planted in the air vent to incapacitate the pilots. Traces of pentaerythyroid tetranitrate, a high explosive, were found. The murder of Zia and his fellow passengers have never been solved, as Edward J. Epstein, the journalist who did a major investigative piece on the incident for Vanity Fair, has pointed out. It was not unlike Agatha Christie's thriller Murder on the Orient Express, in which if one looked hard enough, everyone aboard the train had a motive for the murder. First, there were the Soviets, who had every reason to want to dispose of America's favorite Cold War ally. Then there was India, which resented Zia's supplying of Sikh separatists with weapons. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's mother, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, had been assassinated by Sikh terrorists previously. John Gunther Dean, the American ambassador to India at the time, publicly suspected the Israeli secret agency Mossad of being the assassins. They were hoping to put a stop to the Pakistani nuclear program, as did Barbara Crosset. New York Times South Asia Bureau chief from 1988 to 1991, who wrote a probing piece in World Policy Journal on the subject. Then, of course, there was the usual suspect, Al-Zulfikar. It had initially taken credit for sabotaging the plane, though Murtaza retracted this statement after he discovered the American ambassador had been on board. Epstein himself inclined to the theory that it was an inside job organized by the Pakistani military, for neither Zia nor Rahman had wanted to go to Bahawalpur but had been pressured to do so by the army command. The Pakistani military authorities, in their turn, tried to put the blame on Shiite extremists, and what of the Americans? Had they grown tired of their favorite bulwark against communism, the Muslim bomb? After all, was still being actively developed despite Washington's sticks and carrots. Police investigation was derailed in the usual Pakistani style. No autopsies were performed on the victims, and despite the death of Ambassador Rafael and General Besson's, US Secretary of State George Skirts requested that the FBI keep out of the investigation whether or not the United States was directly or indirectly involved. The perception in Washington seemed to be that a thorough investigation of the disaster might turn up all kinds of unsavory information that the world had better not know. Its policy now has to close the door on the sketchy, compromised past and to back up post-Jia Pakistan with an attractive, secular, American-educated young woman as its leading political figure. The 250 pages of documents related to Jia's death in the US National Archives are still classified. Bhutto herself, according to Christopher Hitchens' account of his conversation with her, after her first election victory, chose to believe that it was none other than the deity himself who had rid the world of the evil man. You will think this sounds irrational and unscientific, but I think the death of Jia was an act of God. An act of God. First it said there was a missile that hit the plane. No evidence of missile found. Then it was a bomb. No evidence of bomb. Now they say there must have been gas to knock out the crew. But I think you should read the section of the Quran about Pharaoh the tyrant, where it says, "Look for him in the sky. You won't find him. Look for him on the earth. You won't find him." Jia had disappeared in flames. He denied our family the Muslim right to a last look at my father's dead face. Well, no one saw his dead face. And the plane. Here she leans forward very intently. The plane that crashed was the one that threw my father's body from the jail where he was hanged in Rawalpindi, and the only thing not burned in the wreck was the Holy Quran. She sits back. God gives the tyrant a wound, but he tucks it in the end. Plenty of people all over the world breathed a sigh of relief at Jia's death, but Benazir Bhutto was its most obvious beneficiary. She was no longer politically shackled to her father's murderer. She need not run for office as Prime Minister to his president, and now her luck continued to hold. Jia had ordered elections for November, perhaps assuming that by then she would be ready to deliver her baby and unable to campaign vigorously. In the event, her son Bilawal Jardari was born on September 21, allowing his mother plenty of time to build up steam for the November election. The feeling of hope that surged through liberal Pakistan society may have been irrational, but the return of democracy in however compromised a form was truly a magical moment. The novelist Kamila Samsi, a teenager at that time, later recalled the spirit of 1988 rather ruefully. Given the state of Pakistan today, 2010, it is impossible to remember the heady day at the end of 1988 without tasting ashes. Elation was in air and it was a soundtrack. At parties, my friends and I continued to dance with the UK's top 40. But the songs that ensured everyone crowded onto the dance floor were the Pakistan and the election songs of both Benazir's Pakistan People's Party and the Karachi-based Muhajir Qawmi movement. There was little concern for political affiliation. At one such party, I recall a young Englishman looking perplexed as Karachi's teens gyrated to a song with the chorus ZZZZ Bhutto Benazir Long Live Jiye Benazir Bhutto. I can't imagine a group of school kids in London launching to a long live Maggie, he said, and I pitied him and the English teenager for not knowing what it was like to see the dawn of democracy. The heady atmosphere of the election, with surging crowds of adoring supporters, greeting Bhutto at the series of the rallies she held all over the country, was a period unlike any other in Pakistani history. She carried out a grueling campaign schedule with the tireless zeal of her father. Despite the interruption of Bilal's birth as the unchallenged figurehead of the PPP, Nusrat perhaps reluctantly had ceded her dominant role to her more energetic daughter. She was now in position to recreate it in her own image. It was an image that should have given the traditionally leftist power base of the PPP pause. Her choice of landowners and other power brokers for places on the party ticket reflected not only the apparently unshakable inequities of Pakistani society, but her own values as well. And while the world and idealistic Pakistanis like the young Chimera, Shamsi and her friends might have seen a progressive woman about to accede to the kind of power that could enable her to change her troubled country for good. The reality was rather different, as Bhutto must have known from the beginning, as the example of her father had proved more than a decade previously. No civilian can lead Pakistan without striking some sort of deal with the military, and Jia's sudden exit from the scene had left the country under the rule of three men who were implacably hostile to parliamentary democracy. First, there was General Aslam Bey, who had so providently escaped the fatal plane crash and had now taken over as the new army chief. Then there was the head of the ISI, Lieutenant General Hamid Kul, described memorably by the American journalist Lawrence Wright as a short man with a rigid military posture and raptor-like features. He had helped oversee the creation of the Taliban. His special protege was the Pashtun warlord Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and openly supported it right up until 9/11. And finally, there was the new president Ghulam Ishaq Khan, the chairman of the Senate, who had ascended to the presidency after Jia's death. According to constitutional regulations, a civilian figure, Ishaq Khan had nevertheless worked closely with the military throughout his career and had been a key aide to Jia. These three men, often referred to by journalists as a troika, were fearful that a liberal civilian government, given any real power, would reduce the military budget and perhaps even shelve the all-important nuclear program. With these fears predominating, Aslam Beg contacted Bhutto, praising his commitment to fair and timely elections if she would agree to reinstate him as army chief in the event of her election. Other conditions were also exacted. The defense budget would be non-negotiable. Ishaq Khan would stay in office as president to her prime minister. Jia's foreign minister, Yaqub Ali Khan, would also stay in office. The army would hold the ultimate veto in security and foreign matters. The civilian government would have no say in the nation's Afghan policy, and the nuclear program would stay entirely under the control of the military. With little choice in the matter, Bhutto hurriedly agreed to the terms. The implications of that agreement were to be more serious than she might have realized. In the meantime, the Troika had not abandoned hopes that Bhutto might yet be defeated at the polls. As she pointed out in her autobiography, she and other PPP insiders were shocked when Ishaq Khan kept the caretaker government consisting of Zia's cronies and henchmen instead of a neutral and impartial cabinet. These were the same representatives of Zia's corrupt system to whom fair and impartial elections would mean the end of their own power and patronage. The Supreme Court had ruled out against Zia's injunction preventing candidates with party affiliations from running for office, and the Troika now supported a coalition of parties that opposed the dominant PPP. The most notable of these was the ISI-backed IJI, the Islamic Jamhuri Ittihad, Islamic Democratic Alliances. Bhutto confronted Islamist fears about women leaders head-on in her best Oxford Union fighting style, asserting that women were, if anything, even better qualified than men to act as a nation's parent figure. Sovereignty belongs to God, she stated later. Men and women are his trustees. The trustees vote for a government. Therefore, as the trustees have voted for a government, that government has come into being by the will of Allah and is an expression of his sovereignty. So it is Islamic to have a government led by a woman. This was good casualty, but by no means reassuring to hardcore Islamists, who found Bhutto threatening not only on principle as a woman, but also in particular as her secularist father's daughter. Peter Galbraith, who had flown to Pakistan as part of a delegation to monitor the elections, joined the Bhutto Zardari clan in Larkana on election day. That night we were in her living room at Larkana. Galbraith recalled. Banerjee was in the corner on the phone, getting the results present by present. And initially the results came in and they began to show a rather large win for the PPP. As that became clear, it began to slow down. The next day, it had emerged that she had 94 seats, so it was sort of majority. But the next party, the Muslim League, had about 55. The attitude among her advisors was that they had been robbed. This is the mentality of people who have spent their entire life in opposition. They are always seeing the regime as trying to issue them, as indeed it was, and I am sure that there were robbed seats. I think that's quite clear. The press officer wrote up a press statement for Banerjee to keep complaining about the results. In Bahawalpur and Sargodha, they had been robbed, so they should have had more seats in Punjab. And Banerjee gave this to me to look at. I looked at it and I said, well, I'm sure this is true, but I can guarantee you that the international journalists who are outside the wall, CNN, ABC, CBS, BBC, German TV, none of those guys know where Sargodha and Bahawalpur are. And while they know where the Punjab is, their viewers don't. They have come here to cover this incredible story about this young woman who is now about to become the first elected Prime Minister of a Muslim country. Instead of complaining about how you have been robbed, why don't you tell them you won? She quickly saw the point and asked Galbraith to draft an acceptance speech for her. I wrote up the most conventional of statements. The people have spoken. It's the heaviest of responsibility, he said. Then we left abruptly to the airport. Dusk had fallen and the airport was, I think, 25 miles away. When we left, there were people all along the route, 10 deep, cheering. It was so moving. And then we landed in Karachi and there were 500,000 people on the tarmac. In the final tally, the PPP had taken 94 out of 107 seats in the National Assembly. The runner-up was the IJI with 56. This was a very good result for the PPP, but not quite as good as it might have been, for the party achieved an outright majority only in its home province of Sindh. The IJI had control of the Punjab, Pakistan's largest and most powerful province, and its new chief minister was a man who would prove Bhutto's principal political rival for the rest of her career, Nawaz Sharif, the powerful conservative Lahore businessman who had been a protege of Jia's. Sharif's election campaign, writes Hussain Haqqani, had unleashed a xenophobic Pakistani nationalist tinged with more Islamist than had previously been the norm in Pakistani politics. Ideas nurtured under Jia's authoritarian rule now had a democratic manifestation. Beg and Gul could keep Bhutto in check by pitting the Punjab provincial government against the Prime Minister. Once the new National Assembly was in place, the Inter-Service Intelligence attempted to lure newly elected PPP legislatures to defeat to the IJI, and the Troika had not yet accepted the inevitable. On November 19, the PPP won the most seats in the provincial assemblies, as well as the national 184 seats to the IJI's 145. Still no word from Ishaq Khan, who as president was now constitutionally obliged to call on the leader of the party with the largest number of votes to form a government. Unwilling to instate Bhutto, he was praying for time, while the military approached elected PPP members and tried to persuade them to defect from the party and bring as many of their fellow members as possible with them. The Troika even considered asking Nusrat Bhutto to form a government. They felt that the rather tired older lady, still recovering from her cancer treatment, would prove far more malleable than her aggressive, energized daughter, and Nusrat, somewhat surprisingly, did not dismiss the idea. So much for Benazir's assertion that her mother had never wanted power. 2 weeks went by in this waiting game, during which time Bhutto wrote a letter to the international community, laying out the situation. She had Mark Siegel, her lobbyist, pass out copies of this letter to members of the US Congress, and PPP party members in Britain and Europe provided copies to leading MPs. Inevitably, it was not the will of Pakistani people, but the will of Washington that finally buzzed Ishaq Khan. He had no option but to yield when the US ambassador Bob Aubrey phoned him and insisted that he ask Bhutto to form a government. Ishaq Khan's inability to resist this demand only showed the truth in the old Pakistani saying that the most important person in the country is not the head of state or even the army chief, but the American ambassador, none too cynical Islamabad's insider as the viceroy. Thank you very much for listening. This is the end of chapter 9, page number 75. Thank you.